The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a document similar to a global roadmap for freedom, equality, and the dissemination of a culture of peace, which was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly after World War II in Paris on December 10, 1948, which called on the international community to implement international human rights standards, as the United States of America led the scene in the end of the 70s of the last century, led by the late U.S. President Jimmy Carter, in adopting the peace process between Egypt and Israel after the October 1973 war by signing the Camp David peace agreement in 1978, as well as establishing diplomatic relations with China, as well as signing the SALT agreement to limit strategic arms with the Soviet Union to end the Cold War period, until the period of presidents followed after that, to represent a not bright era since the beginning of the rule of George W. Bush, the invasion of Iraq, the public violation of human rights, and after that the rule of President Obama, where there was hope to use law-abiding reform policies international and non-discrimination based on his African roots. Then President Donald Trump took power and his crude policy, as he withdrew from the International Trade Agreement for Weapons, which regulates the transfer and deployment of small arms and light weapons, which are part of achieving security in the country and stopping the commission of indiscriminate crimes. Then the current president, Joe Biden, whose tenure in power is witnessing violations against black citizens by the security forces, U.S. foreign policy and human rights. At the beginning of the new millennium, the United States of America adopted foreign policies with double standards on human rights issues and exploited them to maintain international hegemony as the global superpower. The country demanding the protection of human rights became the country that most violated human rights, with the assumption of former President George Bush to power, where he committed crimes of torture against peoples, in violation of the United Nations Convention Against Torture and international humanitarian law, without being criminally prosecuted, as his tenure as president witnessed the construction of secret prisons of the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, which practiced the worst torture operations, including the use of waterboarding and ill-treatment during interrogation, following the events of September 11, 2001. Guantanamo prison has been used in Cuba since 2002. It is a living example of the brutality of the U.S. administration, where detainees are held outside the scope of the law and deprived of their rights, with the use of the most heinous methods of torture that violate international norms and human values. According to the account of one of the Guantanamo detainees, Majid Khan, a 35-year-old Pakistani who has been charged with conspiracy, espionage, and murder, told his lawyer that some of the worst torture methods he was subjected to occurred during an interrogation session in May 2003 when agency guards stripped him. The CIA completely stripped him of his clothes and hung him from a wooden beam for 3 days, giving him nothing but water. The only time they took him off the beam was the next afternoon when the interrogators handcuffed him and put a hood over his head and then lowered him into a basin of ice water, and then one of the interrogators pushed Khan's head under. Then the interrogator raised his head above the water and asked answers to questions, then pushed his head back under the water, as the guards poured water and ice from a bucket on Khan's mouth and nose. Then Khan hung on the crossbar, naked except for a head covering, and every 2 hours or 3 interrogators were pouring ice water on his body while depriving him of sleep. This is part of the story of one of the detainees, which the Senate report did not address during its discussion of this file, and hundreds of people are still in Guantanamo despite the promise of the U.S. administration before the world closed it. 2003 invasion of Iraq. In light of the United States of America raising the slogan of democracy, accountability and good governance, and the promotion of human rights, it committed the most heinous crimes against the people of Iraq under the name of combating terrorism after the events of September 11, 2001. It invaded Iraq in 2003 in alliance with international forces under the pretext of disarming weapons of mass destruction, and it carried out this invasion without respect for international humanitarian law, and it also killed children, the elderly and women, and targeted the bombing of all places of worship and cultural places such as museums and temples, and seized all the oil wells in the Iraqi lands where they came under its control. But the living example of the violation of human rights is the construction of Abu Ghraib prison, in which flagrant violations were committed, as it became on the same path by repeating the brutal acts committed in Guantanamo Bay in this prison, but the strategies of torture were not mentioned in the wars of the modern era, as they included sexual and physical assaults on prisoners, and pictures were leaked from inside imprisonment for these atrocities, along with one of the other photographs in which a prisoner appeared standing on a box wearing a black mask with electrical wires in his hand. These are all documented evidence proving that the United States of America committed war crimes against humanity and violated international conventions without being held accountable. U.S. domestic politics and human rights. The domestic policy of the United States of America is an integral part of its foreign policies, the facts of which witness the declared violation of human rights and international laws, and this was traced inside the violation of the American Declaration of Human Rights and Duties stipulated in Article 2, through racism and discrimination that follow against Black American citizens who made up 48.8 million out of 329.5 million people in 2019, and whose roots go back to Negroes and immigrants who are brutalized by U.S. police, shot with live bullets and detained without evidence of crimes. This prompted one of the specialized rapporteurs of the United Nations to admit that these racial differences are a remnant of slavery and apartheid. The most prominent crimes of racism against blacks. Former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin committed the murder of a black citizen, George Floyd, while he was pinned to the ground in order to be arrested by the city police on the pretext of trading counterfeit money in a store, as the store owner claimed, where the police officer pressed Floyd's neck with his knee to prevent him from moving during the arrest for about 9 minutes, which led to his death. A civilian, a white man, opened fire and killed 22 black people in a Walmart store in El Paso, Texas, and his crime was motivated by hatred of Hispanics, prompting a group of prominent human rights lawyers and human rights defenders from all over the world to prepare an international report, monitoring the police killing of black Americans over a long history of violations of international law, which in some cases rise to the level of crimes against humanity. They also called on the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court in The Hague to open an immediate investigation with a view to prosecutions. Some statistics issued by the U.S. Census Bureau indicated that the United States is the only developed country with millions of hungry people, as there were 39.7 million people living in poverty in 2018, and in one night in 2020 there were more than 500,000 Americans who lacked permanent shelter. In addition, 65 million adults chose not to seek treatment for a medical problem because of the cost. Throughout history, it has been shown that domestic policy effectively influences foreign policy because of its importance in shaping the parameters of the latter. Monitoring the human rights situation in the United States of America according to the United Nations report. During the discussion of the file of the Universal Periodic Review of the United States of America in 2015 at the United Nations, the UN report clarified some recommendations directed at it, including the need to adhere to international conventions and treaties, and to ratify the second optional protocol to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which aims to abolish the death penalty. Some countries have called on it to ratify the Convention on the Elimination of Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Convention on the Rights of the Child and Persons with Disabilities, and to consider acceding to the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture, as well as to ratify the International Labour Organization Convention on Discrimination in Employment and Occupation, and to ratify the Convention Arms Trade and Strengthening the International System in the Transfer of Small Arms and Light Weapons. Recommendations came from many countries to ratify the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, as well as to establish a central national institution for human rights. Finally, it is clear from the above that the United States of America is implicated in committing crimes against humanity, and does not have sufficient strategies to improve human rights conditions to eliminate poverty and unemployment, and the failure to provide health care, in light of the practice of various forms of discrimination. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is a document